The front row is normally where the ministers sit, so now's your chance to sit in a ministerial chair.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the jointly sponsored Government of Luxembourg and AIB panel on gender equality for sustainable infrastructure. I'm Michaela Bergman. I'm the Principal Social Specialist at AIB. It's quite a formal room, so I do encourage people to come a bit nearer because I can't see everybody at the other end of the room. That's my failing eyesight. I'd just like to a couple of housekeeping. If those of you who please access the AIB app and also fill out any surveys afterwards. So I'm really pleased to see you all here, and I'd like to introduce to you my panel members, some of whom I've known for several years and some of them a little more recently. So could I ask you each to introduce yourself, please? Eva, would you like to start?
Good afternoon. My name is Eva Keil. I'm the gender planning expert of the city of Vienna. I'm a trained urban planner, but I was also the first head of the women's office of the city of Vienna, and then I combined those topics, and so since 30 years, we've done quite a lot of projects in gender planning issues.
Shafiq.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shafiqul Islam Akand. I work for the government of Bangladesh, and I basically am a civil engineer, and then I have had my urban planning degree, master's in urban planning. And I was the project director of Asian Development Bank assisted multi-sectoral urban infrastructure improvement project, and which had a strong gender component. Thank you.
Undersecretary Kathy.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Undersecretary Maria Catalina Cabral of the Department of Public Works and Highways from the Philippines. I'm a licensed civil engineer. I have two master's degree and 2 doctorate degrees in the field of urban planning. I'm the chairperson of the Committee on Gender and Development of the Department of Public Works, having worked with government for the past 30 years. I'm also the national president of the Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers for the 2017 and 2018. I actually rose from the rank, started as civil engineer in the government. And most importantly, I'm a mother of 2 girls.
Thank you. Chris.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Hurst. I'm from the European Investment Bank, so it's EIB. It sounds a lot like IAAB, but it's EIB. When I told my daughter I was coming here, she said, "You've got to be kidding me. Doesn't the EIB have any women that can talk about gender equality?" And I explained, well, actually, it goes beyond just an issue for women. I head the projects directorate, which includes the engineers, the economists, the environmental specialists, but importantly, for the context of this meeting, also our social experts and our gender experts. It's great to be on a panel with such gender experts on it. I mean, I certainly can't claim to be a gender expert at that level. I think I have a very good idea of the issues, but also maybe I can bring a sort of managerial perspective to the issues that gender brings. Just one word, that AIB is located in Luxembourg, and so I'd like to say a word of thanks to the Luxembourg authorities for all the organisation they've done to these events. I mean, Luxembourg is a good example of a country which promotes gender equality, and it has, for example, in its public transport planning, put careful considerations of the routes for buses to take into account the gender interests in connecting schools with the workplace. It's also, by the way, the first country that's made public transport completely free as of the start of next year, which will obviously also have a big impact for social inclusion as well as for the climate. But anyway, I look forward to the discussion later.
And Nato?
My name is Nato Kurshita, Bank's Transport Global Practice. I have up to 11 years of work experience working on gender issues with a specific focus on infrastructure sector. Previously, I spent up to 7 years in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then as well in UNECE, UN Economic Commission for Europe, and I specialized mainly in 2 regions, Europe and Central Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. As many people know in the audience, good access to quality and sustainable infrastructure is an essential determinant of people's well-being and a basic requirement for businesses to prosper. As the OECD has recognized, infrastructure is essential to foster equal opportunities to connect left-behind regions, ensuring easy access to public services for citizens, and in general to improve the quality of life. However, it's often assumed that women will automatically benefit from new infrastructure projects in the same way that men do, without acknowledging possible distinct impacts on women and men according to their needs and social roles. Women and men use infrastructure differently. For example, surveys show that women rely more on public transport than men do, but the transport sector remains male-dominated. In Europe, the transport workforce is 22% female, despite women accounting for 46% of the total workforce. And as for the Asia-Pacific region, in 21 APEC economies, women are typically found in fewer than 20% of transport jobs. Inadequate access to water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities disproportionately affects poor women and girls, constraining their educational pursuits, economic productivity, and often putting themselves at risk in terms of safety. Different social roles and physical needs of men and women mean that men and women use and navigate cities and settlements differently. And concerns about safety are different for men and women. The AIB is a young multilateral development bank set up in 2016 with a mission to improve social and economic outcomes in Asia through the financing of infrastructure. The bank's in the process of developing its approach to gender equality and the infrastructure it finances in a way that makes sense for its level of resources and its mandate. As an institution, we want to learn from our peers, member countries, and experts about how might be the most effective way in closing gender gaps in the infrastructure it finances, in terms of both access to the actual infrastructure and services, as well as to the employment opportunities generated during construction and operations. During this session, we'd like to sort of cover 4 questions. One is, what are the gender gaps in different infrastructure sectors? Examples of the measures that can be taken to close the gender gaps. How should gender gaps be measured, and how should we know when we've been successful? And advice for the young institutions, such as the AIB. So for my first question I'd like to ask, talking about, is what do we mean by gender gaps, and what sort of measures can be taken to close them? So Undersecretary Cathy, what does the Department of Public Works do, and how does it address gender gaps?
Thank you. Department of Public Works and Highways in the Philippines. We are one of the 3 infrastructure agencies implementing not just the national roads and bridges and highways, expressways, but also we are mandated to plan, design and implement flood control structures and other water resources projects. Of course, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Philippines. We are one of the most disaster-stricken countries. No? We're exposed to a lot of disasters, particularly flooding. And we in the department, we have developed a toolkit, actually, with the support of a World Bank on transport to mainstream gender equality, to start off from the study design, construction, and operations. While we have this toolkit for the transport sector, we don't have the same toolkit for other infrastructure, such as flood control or other water-related projects. So I think this is a gap that we want to address in the near future.
Chris, people often say that energy is gender neutral. Can you tell me about EIB's experience?
Well, in fact, the energy sector is a very interesting example because the first reaction is what's that got to do with gender. In fact, if you dig a bit deeper, you do find there's a number of issues that emerge. I mean, to start with, an energy project is still a project, and it occupies physical space, and so disrupts local communities that were economically active and living in that space. So the first question you have is, are women properly consulted in the process of designing those investments? And there may be steps you have to do to ensure that's the case, including separate meetings for women in some cases, and maybe with women who host and manage the meeting. There's also clearly the question of who, well, there's also, when you're building a project, you can have an influx of single male construction workers that can lead to sexual harassment, even sexual violence towards young women and girls in that area. So also you have to take steps to manage that and to control that, and things can be controlled through proper planning and management and supervision. But there's also the question of how are the benefits of the project distributed. I mean, it's still unfortunately the case that many people live in energy poverty. Even in Europe, we have 11% of the population that is unable to properly heat their houses. And often the groups that are most vulnerable include women, include elderly women in particular, simply because of the incomes that they have. But also if we think of electricity supply project, which is bringing electricity into a new area, into a village, how that electricity is connected to households and how it is accessed is obviously something that can have a significant impact. And so we've seen, for instance, the projects that have decentralized off-grid solutions, so PV lanterns and the like. We had a very interesting project in Kenya along those lines, which gives much greater discretion and access for women to connect to have lighting at the home, which they can use for education of their own of their families, but also for the entrepreneurial activities. So there are, even how you think of this, the solution can have a gender impact. We also, when we're looking at the companies that are investing the projects that we are financing, you can also see that there are ways in which you can help them improve the role of women in their own workforce. So there's a variety of steps that can be taken. Even though your first reaction may be that the energy sector doesn't have much to do with gender, there are very significant gender dimensions that we should think through and that will influence the selection of our projects.
And Nata, you work in the transport sector at the World Bank.
Sure. So our experience, as well as the world evidence, indeed shows that women and men experience transport differently, especially when it comes to affordability, availability, acceptability of transport systems. For example, sexual harassment whilst walking down the street or being on a crowded bus is often further exacerbated by the lack of lighting or lack of suitably qualified and trained security personnel. And this has effect on everyone, but particularly on women and girls, limiting their mobility and their employability and earning options. So, lack of safe transport options in our portfolio shows that it can translate into girls missing the schools, women not looking for jobs far away from homes, women dropping off from workplace, and women not being able to access healthcare and childcare facilities. So the impact is massive. According to the recent estimates of the International Labour Organization, safety and lack of access to public transportation is in fact the single largest obstacle to women's participation in the labor force, limiting their participation probability by as much as 16.5%, which is huge. Now, another point very interesting is that it's not just transport services that men and women experience differently, but it's the transport infrastructure. Men and women have different needs, concerns when it comes to, let's say, pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, street lighting, or even public amenities such as toilets or ticket queuing lines in the terminals. If these seemingly very minor features are not reflected in the project design, planning and design, this will affect all, but particularly women and girls. Another issue which already my colleagues mentioned earlier is that lack of gender services, gender responsive service, and lack of women in the sector very often reinforce each other. We know that transport sector remains heavily male dominated, and this contributes to women's voices as users of transport not being adequately reflected in the provision of service. Now, what is the World Bank doing? Acknowledging that transport sector provides huge benefits and advances gender equality. A couple of years ago, the World Bank accelerated its efforts to more forcefully address gender gaps in transport sector by creating a gender task force within the transport global practice, which I am part of. So part of our job is to address gender gaps by working with our task teams, operations, and another one is to lead and support global dialogue on gender and transport. Just to give you a number of examples, project examples, we are working currently in Ecuador, in Quito Metro, to address sexual harassment in public transportation by devising robust reporting mechanisms, by running public awareness campaigns and training. We are working with the government of Jordan to address sexual harassment by implementing sector-wide code of conduct that will regulate the passenger, transport provider, and their employee behavior, which also addresses sexual harassment as one of the things. We will be working in Pakistan, Bus Rapid Transit Project, to train, recruit, and onboard female drivers and conductors. And we're working now in Albania to employ women in the construction sector through our road project. But these are small interventions here and there. What I would like to say and summarize is that effectively, in order to address gender gaps more sustainably, we need to start investing in sex desegregated data, because we need to have sex desegregated mobility and employment data in order to construct baseline, to have proper interventions and to track progress. We also need data to convert those who still do not believe there are gaps in the sector. We need to also keep in mind that social norms and behaviors that influence gender very much affect women's mobility. For example, we know in certain communities that women have constraints in terms of the mode of transport they use and how far they go. We also know that in certain contexts, bystanders do not intervene to stop sexual harassment. So just providing employment, which is great for women, or just taking this service is good but is not enough. We need to invest in shifting the mindsets. And the final point I would like to make is that the success of addressing effectively gender gaps in the sector really rests in acknowledging that transport is not an end, but it's a means to access to services and employment generating opportunities. And to achieve this goal, gender needs to be considered and reflected at the onset of the project planning and not something to be added as a random component at a later stage of the project, which sometimes happens. Thank you.
Shafiq, you've worked in a multi-sectoral loan in Bangladesh. Could you tell us a little bit about how you identified the gaps and what you did to address them?
Thank you. Actually, our project addressed infrastructure improvement in a few selected secondary cities, not in the larger cities. And then the project duration was for 6 years. And then infrastructure improvement that was led by governance improvement. The first 1.5 years, there was no infrastructure investment. So the municipalities, they practiced a set of governance criteria, and among which there was a strong gender integration criteria, about a few. And then schemes are not identified, and the sub-projects also are not. And during the selection process, we had gone through a huge consultative process at the ward level and also at the municipal level. And it was a mandatory provision that at least 40% women will be consulted at both the levels. And then they prepared one municipal development plan, which was a priority ranking of the required infrastructure. Just for example, for say a road or road development schemes or sub-projects, women requirement was passenger shade and sometimes also separate toilets and sitting place at the bus terminals, at the rail station. And then in water and sanitation subsectors, so the requirement was the extension of the piped water supply, and where the piped water supply could not go, then the separate water installation so that they could not go far away to fetch potable water. And for sanitation, they also demanded, the improved sanitation services. And for their safety, there also street lighting was also there, one of the priorities. And then after identification of those gaps, and then after that initial first phase, so we started investing according to the priority of the schemes later on throughout the implementation of the project. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think some topics are similar all over the world, and it's really the everyday pattern, and it's this combination of paid work and unpaid work, and how the urban structures support this, and the infrastructure within the cities. And we started 30 years ago because your question about was it important to identify a gender gap. And we started with an exhibition. Its title was "To Whom Does Public Space Belong To? Women's Everyday Life in the City." And we showed the everyday life pattern from a small girl to an old lady, from a Turkish migrant to a student in a wheelchair. And so to really show their conditions. And for the first time we made, as you mentioned it, this data segregation. And this was very convincing that we have a problem, because it was 2/3 of car traffic was done by men and 2/3 of pedestrian ways are done by women. And 30 years ago in Vienna, mobility planners were really white, male, middle-class men focused on car traffic, and the city looked like that. And so this makes really politicians aware that we have a problem, because pedestrian issues were not a topic at all. And to make also now the bridge for the future, because this morning I participated on the session here about how to reach the Paris targets about sustainable goals. And I think it's really essential that we come to a sustainable transport, and the transport issue is really linked to pedestrian topics, because it's about the last mile topic. So it's not to make big, marvelous infra projects. You can finance metro lines. It's not from platform to platform, but it's really the impact is also this from door to door. And every public transport user is a pedestrian first. And so this really started that we have all these general lyrics in our documents that pedestrian issues are important. But then this really was this beginning that we take pedestrian issues, really make it very practical and say there is not only lanes that must have a minimum dimensions for cars, but also 2 meters for pedestrian sidewalks. So this really became then a topic with this political support. And so I think this climate change, and now we are discussing this about this, I think it's again so important, the pedestrian issue also, because from the urban heat island and climate crisis, we really know from the figures, it's again women. So the urban heat island, they are really the poor one, the older ones, so that's women again. And where we have the highest challenges, it's technically most difficult in the old dense cities. And again, we need place and to get rid of the cars and to force sustainable transport.
In the Philippines, while we are in the Department of Public Works, while we are trying to institutionalize gender mainstreaming, particularly from the start of the project in the feasibility study to the detailed design, construction, and maintenance, we also have relevant laws. For example, there's a law in the country that requires agencies to have at least 5% of their budget attributed to gender infrastructure. So that means we can formulate projects that may be, and we can programs and come up with several development policies related to gender mainstreaming. We also are encouraging women to be part of the construction and maintenance, particularly in maintenance. So we have this policy that 50% of the construction labor can be skilled or unskilled, and these are open and accessible to women and men in the country, in the Philippines.
I was going to actually go on to the next question, but Chris, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to react to the question: is the world different in different places? And I have the daughter I mentioned before is studying science in the UK, and I know a little bit of UK statistics as a result. And we have the question of trying to bring more women into the workforce in the companies we are supporting. And we see, for example, in the UK that up to the age of 18, only 20% of the population studying physics are girls. The 80% are boys. So the girls are already taking at a very young age decisions that eliminate them from part of the workforce, and as a result, very few women are working in industrial as engineers in industry, and even fewer are working in construction.
Thank you. So, going on to about how, we talk about that there are gender gaps, but how do we actually measure them, and therefore are we able to communicate? Nato, could you briefly tell us what you think, how you're measuring them?
So sex disaggregated data is limited for every domain, but it's particularly so for infrastructure. But before we even decide how to measure, we have to understand what we would like to measure. So, for example, we know that women are not a homogeneous group, and they have different needs for transport due to the differences in terms of their income, occupations, age, geographic location. So we know that mobility surveys explore behaviors and perceptions. So in these mobility surveys, we should explore and go beyond gender and look at these domains or dimensions, right? Demographic and socioeconomic dimensions, to have a fuller understanding of a challenge of a broad type of a road user. As I mentioned earlier, the mobility surveys should also explore gender differences in affordability, in accessibility, and in availability of transport. And as Eva already mentioned, we should go beyond the transport line, and we should ask the question what the challenges are for women as well as men in terms of their door-to-door travel. We should consider their first mile and last mile of trips, because, for example, it's usually with the first mile of trip, which is the commuting from house to a stop, or the last mile of a trip, which is from the bus stop or the stop to their destination, when women and girls usually experience the most harassment and violence. And that makes their trip the most lengthy, unsafe, and costly. So if we are collecting data, and for example, let's say for a transport project that has point A to point B, and we are not asking and exploring the questions how women get to these transport points, what are the feeder routes, what are the transit transport, we are really failing a significant number of beneficiaries in the project-affected communities. Now, in addition to mobility surveys, it's good to have qualitative research. It's good to have focus group discussions. Very often we have focus group discussions in order to help us design the mobility survey. So this so-called triangulation approach, which is cross-verification of quantitative and qualitative data, really gives us a rich and a fuller understanding of the gendered mobility patterns. Now, in addition to standard mobility surveys, which needs to be really enhanced, there are other methods as well, such as technology-based solutions, using phones that women and men can use, and it is used in order to report harassment, for example, in public space, and to create hotspots where the most harassment happens. We have examples, lots of apps, very useful, one harassment operating in Egypt. There's another one, safety pin in India, that has been rolled out in a number of other countries. So mobility data collection is indeed challenging. We also have a challenge when it comes to sex desegregated employment data, but I have to say this data is still more easily obtainable as compared to mobility data. Many countries collect data on the share of women employed in transport, construction, and storage sectors. And this is also reported on the website database of the International Labour Organization, for example. When it comes to our clients, transport service providers, they usually also collect sex desegregated employment data. If they don't, it's easy for them to collect, and it doesn't involve significant financial implications.
At the EIB, what sort of data are you collecting to measure gaps and impact?
Well, the first thing when you want to drop down from high-level aspirations to detail, you need to make a business case, and to make a business case, you need to have the data to do that. So any activity requiring resources requires you to build such a case. And so we have to ask the questions, or be able to explain how we're going to address the questions of what exactly we're going to be spending, who we're going to reach, and what is the impact we're going to have. And if you don't have a structure like that, it's very difficult to prioritize what you're doing, and it's also very difficult to persuade other people in the organization to give you the resources to allow you to do that. For some publicly available data is there, so we do have some sex disaggregated data in the public domain, which allows us to do benchmarking, but there are serious issues with the quality and reliability of that data. So we have to go further than that. The sort of case studies and analysis allows you to develop your strategy. So we've already talked about the transport area and energy and other sectors, such as supporting the care sector, which allows people to enter women to enter the workforce. These are all issues the way we can look at through case studies, but at the end of the day, you're going to have a project, and for that project, you're going to have to come up with project-specific data to show what you're doing. On the one hand, to have the data that allows you to assess the impact you're going to do, and then also data that allows you to assess the overall value of a program. So you have to also try to find indicators that can be aggregated across projects, and that's far from trivial. I mean, we can think of numbers such as the hours that women save in a particular unproductive task, which now allows them to enter the workforce. So there are statistics like that we have to look at in order to aggregate individual projects into an overall program benefit. And to do that, we have to find one way or another to provide resources to project promoters who necessarily don't have the skills to do that. So we have to find technical assistant money that allow us to allow the promoters collect that data for us. It's very, very difficult, and we've got a long way to go on this area, but it is important that we continue to do that. We continue to try to harmonize the extent possible across organizations, because it's actually, as I say, absolutely critical if we want to get people to put resources into this area.
And Eva, how did you know whether your designs actually had an impact and made the city more accessible for women?
So I think gender planning is also a kind of quality assessment. So I think sometimes it's not necessary to invent the wheel new, but it's really to have this kind of really to have a very specific look about different user groups and advantages and disadvantages. So sometimes, and I think the impact of gender approach is really to do this in a systematic way, to identify your target groups and then really to discuss disadvantages and positive impact. So this is a qualitative assessment approach. But what we also do, and I think that's really, Vienna makes a social survey study every 3 years. It's about 8,000 people being interviewed and about all the topics and of city government and the level of satisfaction. And so this is really, I think, and then you get a timeline. And we are quite happy that we have identified on the general level, there are surprisingly low gender gaps. But what is a good response for Vienna? But for this climate change topic, for example, because we have now our newest, we have the first results of our recent survey, is that there was the questions, do you think that you can live quite decently without a car in Vienna? And this was really interesting that we had a gender gap of 12%. The biggest gap was between elderly, low-educated women and men. And we know also from older surveys that also if you have a car and you can use it the whole day, women used it 20% less than men. And because very often it said women have less money, less income, so they own less cars. And so I think that there is really that women, because I think it's really necessary because we need the acceptance of the population. So I think we experts very often we know what we should do, but politicians have to survive and have to, if they go for this policy, and then they have to get the acceptance of the population. And so I think for this gender analysis, women are really a big support. And so, and I think it's really very necessary to have this focus on this gender for acceptance and also for addressing the target groups.
Thank you, Eva. And Shafiq, how did you know that your approach had been a success? What indicators did you use?
Actually, that process we started at the beginning, at the planning stage of the project. There was a document design and monitoring framework and also one project-specific gender action plan where there were outputs and indicators as well. And as a part of observance of the governance criteria, the municipalities, they had to prepare their own tailor-made gender action plan, which they implemented. And also, there are provisions that they will be spending at least 2 to 3% of their revenue budget each year, and they will increase by 5% each year. So that we monitored. And most importantly, there was a strong consultative committee beside the municipal council that comprised of 50 members, mostly from civil society. And it was a mandatory provision that at least 1/3 women members will be there. So they sit for the regular meetings, and then they also reviewed and monitored the implementation of these targets, and as well as the implementation status of the priority infrastructure, where women voice also were included. And then from all these data and monitoring system, and then the municipalities, their own review by that strong consultative committee, and then we then knew that okay, we achieved up to that level of our initial targets.
Thank you, Shafiq. So we touched upon a little bit earlier about gender inclusive.
Thank you. It's very challenging, especially for women. You know, we know that the construction industry is a male-dominated industry, so it's really quite a challenge, especially for women, to be able to go into the industry. You know. Of course, there are talks of sexual harassment as a problem in the workplace, and not being given equal treatment. Of course, the condition of the workplace. So we have to develop policies, not just in the government, but also for the private sector, be able to ensure that the construction would be conducive not just for the men, but also for women, so that the contribution of the women will grow in the field of the construction industry. In the Department of Public Works, we also have underrepresentation of women in the civil engineering field. That's why we're encouraging our young people, especially those to take up science and technology and engineering, because it's very important for, you know, it's always a perception that women, you know, have different strengths compared to men, but I think that's already a stereotype definition of women. So we also encourage women to be involved in maintenance of our projects that have been completed. You know, we are going to the rural areas for information dissemination. We are promoting awareness by doing consultations and meetings with the rural folks. So that they will be involved not just in the construction, but actually in identifying the proper projects that would cater to the needs of women. The most important thing, you know, the Philippines, we have more than 100 million population, and more than half are women. So there's really a big opportunity for women to be involved in the industry, in the construction industry. And when we speak of relationship between infrastructure and economic growth, we have to tap the advantage of bringing in women. We have to bring in the ideas, of course, the innovations brought about by, you know, skills of women in infrastructure. We're not just into making infrastructure sustainable and resilient, but also the aesthetic parts. Okay, and also in the Philippines, we are, as I said, we are a disaster-stricken country. So many of our infrastructure, not just the transport, should also be sustainable and resilient, and should also be able to cater to the needs of women, many of whom are homemakers and also childminders, while at the same time trying to find opportunities to get paid work. And the construction industry is one of the biggest economic drivers of the Philippines.
Thank you. And Shafiq, can you tell us what employment opportunities for women that your project managed to generate?
Actually, we included that provision. Even the bidding documents spelled out that the contractors should engage at least 20% women worker and also ensure equal wages. in some of the municipalities, because of their location and then sensitivity according to religious rituals, so it was challenging. Then in some of the municipalities, even we achieved more than the target. However, the challenge remains still to ensure the equal wage. And then that involvement of women workers, that was most successful in the slum improvement component, because within the slums, the infrastructure improvement of themselves, they did that one as the beneficiaries, the slum improvement committee, and mostly those are headed by women household members, and those slum improvement component was not done by the contractor. So as the beneficiary, they took part in the construction activities, and that also helped them to understand also the maintenance requirement, and they engage themselves even after construction for the maintenance activities as well. And in the project management and also at the municipal level, there was also a condition that the certain percentage of women employee should be employed. Thank you.
Thank you. And Eva, finally, if you could just briefly say, how do we make planners more aware of employment opportunities?
What we've done is that we used really pilot projects. So we have, over the years, we have realized about 60 pilot projects in different topics. And this learning by doing, I think this produces a high sensitivity. We have done it we have also done a pilot district where about 4 years there was a focus on all involved departments on public space. So it was really a training on the job. And for example, the local politicians there, they made night walks. So they really walked around identified spaces of anxiety, and they made a gender budgeting approach to fix a budget to improve the lighting there. So you really then feel the difference. We also put in the beginning of this process, we put the technicians in wheelchairs. We gave them a pram. We make them walk around with a stock for the blinds, just really to feel it, the obstacles for people. So I think this is, planners are visual animals, so it's really important to also to create pictures. What we also, for participation, I think also participation processes can be gender blind. So one in my PowerPoints, I have a picture for a normal participation process when people have been invited to the office. There were only men on the pictures, or it makes a difference if you are on the place involving all the groups. And we have developed a gender pilot with, again, pictures showing, it was a redesign after extension of a metro line to give pictures what kind of atmosphere people wish there or possible measurements. And we just gave them points, you know this from this workshop, these feedback points, and we differentiated the colors for men and women and small and big one for grown-up and kids and children. And within a very short, you get very decent feedback what people wish. And it was, again, women voting for more green, for pedestrian issues, men for bike infrastructure. So this really works well. And our last instrument, which I really can recommend, we have developed a kind of fairness check. We have used this for our strategic concepts, for our mobility concept and our concept of public space. Because in the end of strategic concept, you always have this kind of measurements, the lists of measurements. And then we involve gender experts, inclusion experts, diversity experts, and we define together target groups depending on the contents of the concept. For example, for the mobility concept, we said not everybody we know from statistics has a smartphone, so we know there is still a group depending on analog information, and all the traffic planners discuss now digital. So we say there must always be a two-channel information. And so we discussed every measurement for the impact for the specific group, and so we could identify blind spots, and we redefined 1/3 of the measurements. And so I think this fairness check is really a good way to rethink if you have the complete picture from the gender lens.
Thank you. May suggest we take 3 questions, and when you're asking your question, maybe you could tell us who you are. Thank you. Put up your hand or put up something to let me. Okay, would you like to?
Thank you so much, and thanks for the wonderful panel. I'm Preeti Daruka. I work with an organization called Program on Women's Economic Social Cultural Rights. I also had the pleasure to monitor your AIIB project in Gujarat rural roads from a gender perspective and had tremendous learning on that. It's wonderful to hear the panelists having such insights. So I have 2 points. One is a comment and one is an observation. The comment first is it's great to see such a wide range of understanding and bringing gender into the transportation aspect. However, I do want to draw attention to that somewhere the transformation part of it is still missing. In spite of this, women are still being seen as a vulnerable group that is discriminated against, as opposed to being seen as an active economic agent, workers, producers, farmers, contributors to GDP. So unless and until that framework changes, we always will look at women that we need to go and protect them as opposed to providing what is entitlement to them as rights. My question is that, to all of you who have provided such wonderful insights into how gender can be inclusive into transportation, then what are the challenges? Why are we not seeing it in the projects, on the ground? Is it because we are hearing it from women experts? Are you facing challenges within your organizations and your expertise are being challenged? Michaela, like there are huge gaps in AIIB in implementing gender. So, there is such a rich understanding on this panel and even with your opening statement, yet why is AIB projects not including gender then?
Maybe let's do another question. Over there, yeah.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Afshan Khan, and I'm the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia for UNICEF. So thank you all for the panelists for a very interesting perspective. I just have one question, and that's how have you used actual data from clients to inform and shape some of your learning from programs? Because now with the whole use of client surveys and the ability for mobile apps to give feedback quickly in real time, that's a real opportunity to take the views of women and how we can transform services. Thank you.
And is there one other question? Please.
Thank you. It's Edward Longhurst-Pierce from OMFIF, which is a think tank that works with central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and public pensions around the world. It was a question really perhaps on the decision-making side and not necessarily on the ground infrastructure development, but on the investment side as well. We produce an annual index that looks at gender diversity across all of these official institutions. We started off with central banks and expanded it to the sovereign funds, etc. We found that only 8% of the world's central banks are headed by women. That's roughly the same for the world's 80 or 90 sovereign wealth funds as well. When we broaden that out to the decision-making groups, whether it's the MPCs or the investment committees across these, it's also quite slim. The scores on our methodology, I think overall were, if 100 was the most balanced score, central banks score about 25% worldwide. In Asia, that drops dramatically to about 9%. So I just really wondered whether there were any views from the panel on particularly the impact on decision-making at those top levels when it comes to infrastructure investment. You know, what are you seeing perhaps also in the Philippines and across there? I think probably quite hesitant to draw any sort of strict conclusions from that, but what was the general feeling and trends that you're seeing?
Thank you. Let me ask the, throw back to the panel. So does anybody, could somebody maybe say anybody's used client surveys to get data? Has anybody in the panel had experience? Chris?
One thing I could add to that, I think we now go into a world of big data and artificial intelligence, which means that we should be able to use these technologies in order to get much more information than we currently have. As regards, if we use client surveys, I look at my experts and they're shaking their heads no. So I guess we have not yet done that.
We in the government, we collect also data, disaggregate them. But the biggest challenge really is how to make meaningful use of this data analytics, you know. I think much has to be done in terms of using this data that we collect to improve the policies and programs that we want to implement as regards to gender-related policies. And therefore, I think that's where we want to improve how to use this data collected. We can collect all the data. We can have all the expert consultants and have all the digital technology give us the data. But how do we turn this data into meaningful information that could help government, particularly at my level, to develop, improve the policies that we have in the public works? And yes, that's still a big challenge, especially for the country.
Do you have anything?
As I already mentioned, we have this constant social survey where this is also direct feedback. I know that there are ongoing research about these digital feedback instruments. I'm sorry I can't answer because they are ongoing, so I don't know it. But I also think there is, what I know from Vienna, again, don't forget the analog world, because we have this consultancy board of public transport users over the years, and they really made excellent input to improve the new lines and changings. And I think to have there, again, a gender-balanced user board, I also think can be a very effective tool.
And talking about decision-making and representation, maybe Nato, could you got anything to say about the fact that maybe there aren't as many women in decision-making roles?
I'd like to briefly also respond to the first one. So there was a question about how we use the client feedback. And the key thing that we are always asked, the main thing is, tell me what is the economic and business case for me to do something on gender. And believe it or not, there's a very strong case, and that's what we are constantly articulating with the clients. To start with, we know that lack of gender-responsive transport infrastructure and service affects negatively transport service providers in terms of their customer service, revenue generation, and operational efficiency. Public transport is the most efficient when it operates at near capacity, right? And it's the least efficient when the usage is the lowest. So, of course, it's in the interest, or it should be in the interest of a transport service provider to accommodate the needs of its diverse passenger base. You have a perfect business case here. When it comes to the economic case, public value of gender-responsive transport service cannot be underestimated either. You know that gender-responsive service encourages more public usage of transport and discourages private usage of transport, enhances road safety, and also, perhaps hopefully, contributes to reductions in emissions. And finally, there's also a very strong case for the governments, for our counterparts, that, for example, addressing high gender inequalities in access to and use of transport contributes to women's labor force participation. Of course, they cannot address and boost economy and help economic growth without addressing these high gaps. So I believe that, going back to your point about the feedback, we are getting, I feel personally also based on my experience, we are getting better and better when we have at least some data. You don't have to have the data in the same country you're working. Bring an example of the neighboring country where you have already successfully conducted a project and articulate this one. So the ease within which then we bring our clients on board is much, much better when we have a very good, very well articulated business and economy case. Going back to your second question about the diversity, as you said, it's difficult to come up and to establish the correlation, right? That this share of increase in women's, in a share of employed has a correlation on that. However, and also we don't have data for construction and transport industries, but broadly there is some research, right, from 500 Fortune companies and others that shows that indeed diversity contributes to better service. For transport, if you could imagine that right now in most of the countries, transport service, especially the roles in the client-facing roles, such as drivers, conductors, this is fully male-dominated. So it only makes sense to put women in these front-facing customer roles, because that will make sure that you have same diversity and as your passenger base, because in your passenger base you are serving half women and half men. I hope I answered partially.
Priti, I'm not going to answer about AIB right now because I'm the moderator and I don't think it's appropriate, but we're having a discussion in about a couple of hours, so I just want to... Chris, do you want to talk about the challenges in an institution?
Sure. I mean, if you're in an organisation which is hierarchical, tending to respect seniority, tending to respect age, relatively little turnover of staff, which I think would probably describe most central banks. It's not surprising, probably describes my own institution as well. It's probably not surprising that you have quite a lot of inertia, and so that the time that it takes for women to progress in the organisation is slow. But what can you do in that circumstance? I mean, I think the main point you have to do is to build awareness of staff. The comment was, you know, there's great ideas in this room, so why aren't we seeing them more widely spread? Well, we have to build awareness in staff to do that. And for instance, Eva did come to the European Investment Bank to meet our urban team to raise awareness with them, and I think that was very successful. So thanks again, Eva, for that. But I think it had a meaningful impact for people to understand the issues that are involved. And you also need to find sponsors that are fairly high in the organization, and you need to have sponsors who build awareness with those sponsors so that they can also help be the spokesperson for these activities and help push it forward.
Thanks, Chris.
Of public works and highways. But I started many years ago, about 30 years ago in government. So I knew exactly how the government or my organization developed in terms of being gender sensitive. We've come a long way. I became the first undersecretary, well, at least the only undersecretary now, the only female undersecretary in the management committee. And we have improved a lot in terms of making the organization gender responsive. We have developed a lot of policies. When I started being a civil engineer, I never realized that I could go up to the ladder of the hierarchy. But now I realize that I'm now in a position to influence the policies and develop programs that would help women, particularly in other marginalized sectors in the Philippines. So I think this is one way that I can help the organization I'm in and the industry I represent to become more gender responsive. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of improvements that we will be needing a lot of experts and a lot of experiences from other countries that are already, well advanced compared to the Philippines. But I guess that my position right now is very important, and decisions decisions are very important to ensuring that our infrastructure will not just be sustainable, resilient, but also gender responsive.
Thank you. Maybe we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to ask the panelists, they can prepare now in 2 sentences, giving AIB a little bit of advice. So anybody have got another question? No? Okay, so I would like to ask the panelists for maybe their 2 sentences of advice for AIB going forward on what it should do. And all advice taken. Thank you. Eva, do you want to start?
From my experience, I think it needs both. It needs bottom up and top down on the same time. So the bottom up is really this go for pilot projects, because then you can develop your toolkit. You can see what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's really necessary to have the support within an institution from the top down. So because I think it's really, what is really crucial, it's not so easy at all to have pilot projects, but what is the real challenge is then to have the consequent rollout of it. So we are still struggling for that also in Vienna. And therefore, you also need this top-down support. So also, and I also think to make also this fairness check within your own structure of IEB. So about, for example, the structure of credit loans, for example, are there also the soft measurements also can be supported as easily, and all the small little steps for the last mile connectivity. And what I really, and this, it's really also a question of capacity. So what I really learned in Vienna, that we have a gender unit needs resources to really get an impact, because to be innovative, you have to try, and then you also need personal resources. If you have done right, then you can become lean again, but for the beginning, this would be my advice, get also personal resources to support their gender actions.
Thank you, Eva. And Shafiq?
From my experience, I can give advice that AIB should set a strong mindset whether they would like to promote gender at all, or with full commitment. Because what I have seen, that well, there are various tiers, but when some projects goes at the board for approval in the other MDBs like World Bank or ADB, then these sort of issues and maybe the specific allocation for gender improvement or to address other social gaps, that was not, receiving very much importance. And also, AIB should employ permanent staffs, not depending on the consultants, because the consultants are mostly for short-term, and institutional memory actually doesn't, remain for a longer period. And in the project design, the gender-specific issues and targets should be fixed with a specific gender action plan, and appropriate budget requirement also is required at the project planning level. Thank you.
First, I'd like probably for AIB to continue this kind of meaningful discussion forum at any opportunities, and to share your expertise and experience with countries like the Philippines on how we can further develop, improve our systems and processes. The toolkit that we did was already about 10 years ago, and maybe it needs already some improvement to address, of course, current times. No? And aside from that, this toolkit that we prepared 10 years ago together with World Bank is only for transport. I think there should also be some toolkit to institutionalize and integrate mainstream gender policies and programs to other infrastructure. particularly water-related, for example, water-related projects, energy also, and this could be part of the collaboration between AIIB and its member countries, and Philippines would be very grateful if we can be supported by AIIB in this undertaking. Thank you.
Four very quick things. One, you have to build awareness through all levels of the organization. As I mentioned before, you need to have somebody at the top who believes in it and will support you. So ideally the president, if not the president, somebody quite close to him has to also believe in it. A formal strategy helps a lot because that keeps it on the agenda, and it keeps the topic being brought back to the management for discussion when you have milestones that you're meeting or you're not meeting. So if you have a formal strategy with targets, is extremely helpful, I believe. And the other thing you should try to do, which we are also maybe starting to do, is to formally build gender issues into your sector strategy. So when you have a transport strategy, I would bet that most people writing a transport strategy don't think to build gender issues into it when they're writing it. And so the same was certainly for energy strategy and the like. So I think if you could sort of formally build in as part of the forward-looking activity at the sectoral level, gender dimension, that will also help to keep it active.
And that, I'm sure the World Bank's got many, many years of experience, but can you just give us one piece of advice?
Oh, I was having 3 points similar, but okay, it was very similar, to have sufficient number of suitably qualified experts for infrastructure, and I'm emphasizing suitably because infrastructure is really specific. Another one is to have, regardless of how much resources you will pull in, you will need to prioritize. We don't have time to discuss how, but this can happen by the size of the gender gaps at the country level, in the sectoral level. That needs to take place to make sure that you direct the resources where it is needed and not to spread yourselves too thin. And the third one is, regardless of how many gender experts you will pull in, as Chris mentioned, you need to increase capacity building of project staff. They don't have to be versed in the sector as you are, obviously, in your team and your colleagues, number of you, but they need to have broad understanding in order to lead basic discussions with their clients, like why gender matters, and bring them on board. This will help greatly.
So on that, Naeem, I've just about made it on time. I was given a very hard deadline. So may I take this opportunity to thank Eva, Shafiq, Kathy, Chris and Nato for their participation, and thank you all for attending. Oh, sorry, because there's another event coming in and it's a very tight schedule. Oh no, you can use both exits maybe. Apparently that exit and that exit, please. Thank you very much.